Hi, and welcome to FlossTube number 25. I'm Jean Farish, and once again, I'm here because you're here, and building this wonderful community of stitchers from all over the world, getting lots of comments and feedback, and it just really feeds my soul, and I hope it's feeding yours as well. So the big news this week is this girl, Jane Hattersley, which I shared with you, framed for the first time last week. And she's still in the news in that, ooh, sorry about that. The shops that I listed last week have already started promoting this piece and taking orders. And I encourage you to shop with one of them, and we can add to that list a wonderful shop. It's relatively new. In the area that's north of Charleston, South Carolina, in a town called Summerville, and that's Poppies. And they're going to be carrying this and participating with us in the Jane Hattersley Stitch Along. So I encourage you to support any one of these stores. And once again, I will list them all in my description that goes along with this episode, so you could easily find them. So that's the big news. Now remember that this is a chart that is all full cross stitches. There are no specialty stitches. There's no stitching over one. What that means is that this sampler can be stitched on Aida, as well, of course, on the traditional linen or on other even weaves if that's your preference. So that's the really big news. I feel like this sampler can really encompass all stitchers regardless of their level. And let me just jump in here and say that even if you're a novice stitcher, or maybe especially if you're a novice stitcher, I would encourage you to join us if the sampler appeals to you, because after all, Jane was 10 years old when she stitched this. The age that I'm seeing is anywhere from 10 to 11, 12 years old. Is very typical age range for a stitcher of one of the samplers that you often see reproduced. Now, granted, life was very different in 1832 when Jane stitched this. She didn't have the distractions of computer games. And her life, of course, was just very different from the life of a typical 10-year-old today. But she also probably had a different set of chores that would flabbergast a 10-year-old today. She also didn't have electric light, and she didn't have magnifiers. Now, granted, she was stitching with the eyesight of a 10-year-old. So all of these things we can balance and say, okay, she was 10, but she was living in 1832, but. So when it's all said and done, I guess what I want to convey to you is there is nothing that would keep a novice stitcher from being able to stitch this successfully. Those of you who've been following along know that when I initially started stitching this, I was stitching it on two different colors of linen, swan feather and pecan shortbread. Now, my reason for doing this was simply because when I matched as closely as I could the original linen color and the original floss colors, and came up with what I'm dubbing the traditional colorway, that's the pecan shortbread and I wouldn't say darker, but the deeper floss colors. While I was working on this, I thought, well, what if Jane had a wider array of linens to choose? And what if she had more floss colors to choose from? Would she have chosen that fabric? And so just kind of playing with that idea in my head, I came up with the idea of also stitching this on the swan feather, which is kind of a very soft white, and kind of brightening the floss colors just slightly. The other change I made was that in the original, Jane uses 2 shades of gray, and in the what I'm now calling the classic colorway, I'm using kind of a silvery gray and another, we used to call it grayish. It was sort of gray and sort of beige kind of combined. A very, very pale, warm taupe sort of color. I don't know, really hard to describe. So they were the big changes that I made, and why when you see the promotions from these shops, you will see what they are referring to as classic and traditional. I came up with a lot of different terms I was using way back, and I first talked about this in episode number 2 of the FlossTube. So if you want to go back and take a look, that's where I first mentioned Jane. Anyway, then I was referring to the lighter color scheme as the modern color scheme. And then talking with Elizabeth about it a little bit, I thought, well, we have the traditional, and then we have non-traditional, or shall I call it the faithful and the unfaithful? And that didn't really sound very good. So we came up with traditional and classic. So hope that explains why shops are referring to 2 different colorways, if indeed they're offering both. I should also say that some of the shops have already figured out what the silk conversions are, so you may see that option available to you as well. So, when you're talking to your favorite shop owner and you're letting them know that you would like to participate in the Jane Hattersley Stitch Along, also let them know what fabrics you'd like to stitch on. Because, if it is a charted design, charted 4 counted cross stitch, it can be stitched on any even weave. And again, we use that term even weave today to refer to Lugana and Monaco and a couple of name brand fabrics that have the look of linen but are not woven with flax, and therefore we don't refer to them as linen. But actually, even weave is a big umbrella term, and under that even weave you actually have Aida, because it is an even weave. It's got the same number of stitches across and down. You've got linen, and you've got what we are now calling even weaves, and that gets to be very confusing for beginner stitchers. But I'm not gonna change the way we refer to these fabrics. So let's keep in mind that in general, when we talk about the fabric that's woven in little squares, that's Aida. And when we talk about the fabric that's woven in threads but comes from flax, that's linen. And when it's woven in threads and is woven with a thread that is cotton or a man-made thread or a combination, then that's what we refer to as even weave. So in terms of Jane Hattersley, though, any one of those 3 types of fabric will work. So hopefully you will find a way to participate with us, because I'm getting very excited about it. And that brings to mind I would love to get some feedback from you as far as, leave me a comment with suggestions on how we can really launch this and celebrate this piece and gather together as a community. Already on my list of things to do will be some sort of a Zoom presentation, but also Facebook Live. And if you have other suggestions on things that we can do together, I would love to hear from you, because I know I have a very creative audience of people, and there may be things that you have seen shops do that will apply to this, or things that you've seen done in non-stitching arenas that you think would apply to this. So let's let's share some ideas and some brainstorm of what we can do. And then on April 9th, we can really really make it a day. Last week when I showed you the steps that I take in mounting a piece of needlework, I used Jane Hattersley because she was simply the next piece in a queue. I'm actually kind of sorry I started with that one, because Jane Hattersley presents two two factors that make it a little bit more complicated in terms of learning how to pin a piece. One is simply its size. A smaller piece is certainly easier to manage. And the other is the fact that it had that very straight line outside border. Even a sampler with a border that isn't delineated like that is a little bit easier to do. So when you're teaching yourself, perhaps start with something a little bit smaller. But between now and the time you finish Jane Hattersley, hone your skills so that when you're ready to do that mounting, then you'll be all ready to do it. So I asked for questions and feedback, and I got a lot of good ones. A couple people asked about mounting Aida and whether or not the process is the same, and the answer to that is yes. Now, with Aida, especially with a small piece, you may be able to skip the basting step and just maybe baste the corners. But doing that basting line will certainly save you time in terms of just your eye just being able to follow that line. So do try to line it up so that you are wrapping it around the foam board right on an Aida line. The other questions, I got a question from someone asking whether or not I drew a pencil line before I did my basting. And the answer is no. I do my best to keep pencils and pens away from my needlework. I think in the long run they can do more harm than good. Now that's just my opinion, although I do have some facts to back that up. I actually think it would be harder to draw a pencil line between two of the linen thread lines than it would be just to baste it. Now I didn't do a back stitch. I was just doing a running stitch, you know, in and out, and they're fairly short stitches. Now I wasn't counting it. I wasn't like going over 2 and under 2, over 2 and under 2. I find that completely unnecessary. The main reason I keep my stitches fairly short is to make sure that I'm staying in the groove or the channel or the gutter, whatever you want to call that space between two linen threads. So once you've identified the two linen threads that you want to follow, that you want to use as your line to wrap around the foam board, just keep making little stitches in between those two lines. And those stitches are irregular. I mean, I didn't pay any attention whatsoever to how many stitches I was going over and under. So I hope that helps a little bit. Let's see what other questions I got here. Oh, keep in mind that Aida doesn't have as much give as linen does, and so it's actually easier to measure the size that you want to cut your foam board than it is linen. The manufacturers who started making Aida back in the 1800s manufactured it in such a way to eliminate some of the challenges of stitching on linen. And one of them is to make the fabric sturdier and for it to have less give, so that you didn't have to worry as much about your tension. A couple of people asked about the fabric I used as my inner lining that I put over the foam board and under my Jane Hattersley sampler. And my advice would be to use something that's 100% natural. A cotton is a good choice, and the weight doesn't really matter. It can be something as light as a batiste or a muslin or a quilt weight fabric, but do stay within the ones that are a very fine weave. The coarser ones like duck cloth, for example, even though it's 100% cotton, I'm not sure that would be the best choice. I got a good question from Karen. In fact, she asked really two questions, and this was the first one half of that question. She said, I'm also intrigued about the pinning technique you use. Why do you not pin the two corners first and then pin the fabric in between to fit. And then she gives me the compliment of saying, I know that there's a good reason why, because you figured this out over all these years. And that is true. So imagine this, and especially with linen as opposed to Aida. If I pin the two corners, on the first side, I would say it wouldn't matter. But when I'm pinning the second side, the side that's opposite that, remember that that's where I had to pull the linen a little bit. It was probably a good 1/4 of an inch between the where the fabric would have fallen naturally and where I actually stretched it to go around that corner. So imagine if I pinned the corners first, then in the middle I actually would have had a sag, and I would have been constantly pulling against that. So I feel like that by doing it gradually kind of down the line, I'm putting maybe less stress on my fabric. It's really hard to explain why I do what I do. But also keep in mind that because of the size of the piece, off camera, I was constantly checking to see where I was, pulling the fabric to see if my corner was going to line up. So sometime in the very near future, I have a couple of smaller pieces that I need to pin, and I need to do that so that you can kind of see the whole piece while I'm doing it. So I hope that makes sense. Another good question I got was from Kim, and she said, Jean, thanks so much for sharing. It's really helpful. Do you label the backs of your framed pieces? And if you do, what information do you include? All right, now I have to confess here that what I advocate and what I do are sometimes miles apart, and this is an example of it. And recently, it has really come home to me how much I am doing myself a disservice by not putting more information, labeling, so to speak, on my projects. Again, with a 40-year span of my design career, I can look at things and remember very clearly what fabric I used, etc. And others, I have no clue. In some cases, those fabrics are no longer manufactured, or a very close facsimile is manufactured with a different name. But that's no excuse. So let me tell you what I am going to try to start doing in the future. One of them, of course, is to identify myself as a stitcher. I would like to include the place where I was, where I was living at the time, or if I was stitching it on vacation or whatever. Of course, the fabric and what threads I was using. Not necessarily listing all the colors, but, was I stitching it in cotton floss? Was I stitching it in silk? Was I using pearl cotton, flower thread, whatever? But I think that what has really hit me is when I look at an antique like Jane Hattersley or Roxana Corson or even my own Janet Irving, what do I wish that those stitchers would tell me today? And that's what I should be putting on my pieces. So, and I'm not necessarily saying, if 200 years from now somebody comes across my stitching, what will they wonder about? It doesn't have to be 200 years. It could be 5 years. It could be 20 years. It could be myself, wondering, looking at a piece that I did in 1988 and saying, was this the one that I did while I was, here, there, everywhere? Is this the one that was inspired by this or that or the other? So just, it doesn't have to be a story. You don't have to be an author like, somebody who writes novels or poems or whatever. Whatever you write down in your own style is a treasure for someone to be reading this later on. So yes, the who, what, where, when, where, the date, your name, etc. are all important. The name of the piece, the designer, would be nice. Now, of course, I'm saying that as a designer, but yeah, like putting down just the information that you take so for granted right now that you are sure you will remember, but you might not. And then adding just a little bit of who you are as a person. So that's a long answer, of course, once again, to a very short question, but that's what I'm going to start trying to do going forward with my stitching. And I'll share a little bit with that. I'll share a little bit of that with you the next time I finish something and have it framed, and I'll share with you what I end up writing on the back. So here's the other half of Karen's question. She said, your very instructive video came at just the right time because I have a question about the shadow that remains when you undo stitching due to an error, etc. My situation is that I undid a dark thread on a light fabric and cannot erase all evidence of that former stitching. I tried various types of tape without success. Can you suggest a product or a technique that will erase all the thready evidence? Okay, this is something we have all faced, and it seems like that inevitably what we have to rip out is navy blue or black or a bright red. And yes, you will end up with evidence, as Karen calls it. So first of all, what is that evidence? Most likely it's microscopic thread fuzzies, just little bits of thread fibers that have been caught on the fabric. It's more likely probably to happen when you're stitching on linen because the fabric's a little bit coarser, but it can happen on any fabric. She took some good steps. I start with sticky tape, but remember, do it on both sides of the fabric. We tend to think of the front, but also do it on the back. And then the other thing would be to go over it gently with a new white eraser. Again, what my friends in the UK call a rubber. This is what I use. It's just a white eraser that comes in this fancy little box thing. And I don't use it for anything other than my needlework. And I find that sometimes going over with that will help. But the big thing, though, and again, you know I am a strong proponent of washing my needlework. And I find it very often that this last little shadow, I can get rid of it by washing the piece. Now, I am such a proponent of washing needlework. I don't always wait until I'm finished with the piece. When I was stitching America Land That We Love over the course of 4 years, I probably washed that a half dozen times, if not more. I kind of figured that after 2 or 3 months of working with it, that it was getting kind of grungy. And so, yeah, I would wash it and iron it and get to start stitching with kind of a fresher piece. I also found that over time that linen got softer and softer and softer. I did not see that as a disadvantage. And it reminds me of the historical kind of backstory that what we think of as being the sheets that we sleep on, that we make our beds up with, we refer to them as linens because originally, you know, again, in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, those bed sheets were made with linen. And you may think, oh my gosh, that would be scratchy. But not after you've washed them and washed them and washed them. They get to be very, very soft. So at any rate, so back to this question. Again, if you're using washable fabric and washable threads, my next step would be to wash and iron the piece and see if that doesn't get rid of the last little bits of the evidence. So again, I hope this helps. I find myself, when I am so freely giving of my advice and sharing my opinions with you, and yes, I recognize that I am a very opinionated person, that I'm I try to make sure that the advice I'm giving you is based on evidence, and that it's based on actual hands-on experiences I have had, or things that I myself have witnessed, or that I know to be true. And I say all this as a preface to something that concerns me all the time. I try not to harp on this, but I just want to tell you, please be careful of the advice that you get through social media. Everybody with a keyboard's an expert, and every once in a while I will read advice that I think that especially somebody new to stitching, that if they follow it, they're just kind of really going down the wrong path. I know that the more experienced stitchers can kind of sift through it and say, I don't know about that. But a new stitcher is like a sponge, and they're just absorbing all the stuff that they're seeing here, there, and everywhere. And recently, somebody asked advice about learning to stitch on linen, that they had been stitching on Aida and they were ready to stitch on linen. And oh my gosh, the things that people posted for this new stitcher, just, it made me cringe. One of them was that when you stitch on linen, your stitches are smaller. And I wanted to say, no, that's not true. If you are used to stitching on 14 count Aida and you start stitching on 28 count linen over 2, you will be stitching 14 stitches to the inch. Your stitches will be the same size. If you've been stitching on 18 count Aida and you decide that you are going to start on 28 count linen, which I personally recommend, then you'd be stitching on 14 stitches to the inch. So your stitches will actually be bigger on 28 count linen over 2 compared to Aida cross stitching. So that is just a falsehood. Okay. Later on, scrolling on down on the same thread, somebody said that before they would start stitching on linen, they advised the person to stitch over 2 on Aida, which really made me want to pull my hair out. What good would that do? All you're going to end up having are these gigantic stitches. If you're stitching on 14 count Aida, and now you're stitching so it's 2 squares high and 2 squares wide, you're going to have 7 stitches to the inch. How does that help that person learn to stitch on linen? Which the only thing you have to learn is watching for the dominant thread. So, and that's getting into a whole nother thing. But again, these are just 2 examples, and there are many, many, many more. In fact, Elizabeth will be busy in the kitchen, and she'll hear me, I'll be sitting in the living room scrolling through various Facebook posts, and she'll only say, oh no, I can't believe this. And she'll come in the living room and say, okay, what now, Mom? So just be careful. And when you are, read through the comments. But, again, the novice stitcher isn't going to know which ones to ignore and which ones to listen to. So that's kind of a problem. Another Facebook post that I saw made me actually want to shed tears for this person. They had finished a project with one of the overdyed threads. And they, of course, decide not to wash it, because we all know that, washing overdyed threads can sometimes lead to bleeding. So they decide to steam it. Well, that's still introducing water to your project when you add steam to it. So, of course, it bled. And in my opinion, it's made even worse by steaming it with an iron, because you're also introducing heat, which can actually set the color. And in fact, steam, one of the many methods used to set dye by professionals is to use steam. It is a recommended process when you are dyeing silk, for example. And I don't mean dyeing, well, I guess it would work for silk threads as well, but I'm thinking of my own foray into dyeing silk scarves one year for Christmas and whatnot. And one of the things I read about and played around with and found that it was very successful was setting the dye with steam. So here, this person who did beautiful work just wasn't making the connection that as soon as she ironed her piece with a steam iron, she was introducing water to her piece. And, you know, again, there's so much to learn, and there are so many ways that we can share information to avoid some of these tragedies. And I'm using I mean, yes, in the great scheme of things, it's not a tragedy, but it's a stitching tragedy. I think you know what I mean. I'm not being heartless about, you know, things going on in the world. But when you have spent hours, and the piece, I know the piece that this person was stitching, we're not talking hours or weeks, we're talking months of stitching. And there it was, blood all over the place. Now, I think she ended up maybe trying some things to get rid of the bleeding. And there were probably some things that would actually help restore the piece. So just be aware that if you are adamantly against washing your pieces, don't use steam. And that's the bottom line. So, let's see, what else is there? I think that's actually the end of my questions I kind of wanted to address today. So oh, wait a second. No, there is one other thing. The other stitch along things that are going on. And in true confession time here, I kind of wish I didn't have the Roxie stitch along and the Jane stitch along right on top of each other, like separated by a little bit more than a month. Would have been nicer to have separated them by a couple of months. But I get so excited about things that I'm creating that I don't want to wait. When I have gone through all the steps I need to go through to prep something to share it with you, I'm ready to do it. I don't want to wait. Let's talk a little bit about the Roxie stitch along. I have cut off the kits that I'm making for that. And by the way, that is one of the big distinctions. I am making kits for Roxie. I'm not making them for Jane. If you want to get a kit for the Jane Hattersley stitch along, you will need to get it from an LNS or an online resource. So the cutoff date for the Roxie kits that I'm making has come and gone. But that doesn't mean that you can't get the fabric and floss on your own from a shop. Now, the shops are not going to have the charts because that one's a mystery stitch along. So there is no chart for me to share with shops at this point. And the whole logistics of giving shops little bits of it as we go along is just a nightmare. So you can still get the chart from me and then get your fabric and floss from other sources. So that's one thing to say about that. This coming week, I'll be sending out an email to all the people that I know that are participating in it to let them know where we are with it. But I did think I would share this photo I took today of Elizabeth. She is busy cutting the fabric for all the kits that we're making for Roxie. And when we cut when we cut our linen for kits, and all your really good shops do this, we cut it right on the linen line. There's not a rotary cutter or anything fast about this at all. So we set up a cutting station upstairs in our kitchen where there's a large window, and she can get the best light. And this is what it looks like when you start cutting a bolt of 25 yards of linen. So I wanted to share that with you. What else about Roxie? Now with Roxie, there will also be stitching video tutorials that will go with that I'll be sending out to people. So each month when I send out the next month's chart, along with it, there will be a stitching tutorial for that section. Floss is ordered for all the kits. Can't wait for that to come in. And I guess that's about it. So right now that one's on target to get started in early March. That whole start date is going to be dependent on when I get my shipment of floss. The other stitch along that I am finished with, but it is really an ongoing thing. It just kind of cycles. You know, you can start it whenever you want to, is Hearts Come Home at Christmas. So 7 stitching videos are out there and open to the public. They are free. Just look for those. And the Peace on Earth, I did not make a set of videos to go with that, but you can pretty much take the Hearts Come Home at Christmas videos and apply those to Peace on Earth if you want to. So wanted to share that with you. I have been suggesting that people use the Hearts Come Home at Christmas videos even if they're not stitching that piece, because I truly do feel in my teacher's heart that the tips and hints and the process that I follow for that project can be applied to a lot of different projects. And so if you have a friend who's a beginner, you know, suggest that they use that set of videos. You know, even if they're just playing in the background while they're stitching, I really do think that they would pick up some tips. So, okay, well, I really do think that is it for the day. And I am, you know, looking forward to this next week. And I am hoping that you will be here with me. So between now and then, stitch happy and stay safe.